Welcome to another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. You're listening to a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State, featuring writer, poet, and musician Rick Pidcock. Now here's Rick.
Welcome to another episode of Highest Power, Church and State. I'm Rick Pidcock, and so far in our episodes over the last few weeks, we've been focusing a lot on politics. We've mentioned some of the theological underpinnings of some of the political reasoning that conservatives had, but mostly the stories have been driven by what's going on in the broader country regarding political decisions that are being made. But today I'd like to focus on some stories that have been going on in the church, and particularly in progressive Christianity, because on Sunday night, it was found out that Grace, the godly response to abuse in the Christian environment, is an organization that was started by Boz Tchividjian, and they have been investigating the New Evangelicals, which is one of the most popular progressive Christian organizations around today. And it was actually requested by the New Evangelicals, and we'll get into that story. But the reason I want to focus on the story in this episode is that my allegiance here is not to progressive Christianity. I am not at all concerned with turning everyone into a progressive Christian or defending a progressive Christian tower of some kind. I'm committed to the flourishing of self and neighbor. And so when I notice people posturing themselves over others in power dynamics that harm people, I'm going to have to call that out. And when that gets to the point where a grace investigation is involved, it's kind of news. So it's something that I can't simply pretend like it's not happening. That said, my current friends tend to live in the spaces of progressive Christianity, or they might be ex-evangelicals of some kind, whether agnostic or atheist. And so from a personal standpoint, this piece was much more difficult for me to write than critiquing a John MacArthur or a John Piper. I know Tim. We've hung out. Tim is the founder of New Evangelicals. We'll talk about. We've hung out. We've had a great time, and I actually sought his advice in starting this podcast. And he went out of his way to be very helpful in sharing his experience with me. But when women are harmed, I have to speak into what's going on. And to be clear, the harm that was caused was the direct result of hierarchy manifesting itself. So my concern in writing this piece was not some personal agenda to take Tim down. My concern was to root out hierarchy for the flourishing of self and neighbor, and specifically for those involved in this story, which would include Tim as well, and the New Evangelical Board. I don't want conservative evangelicals to look at the story and think, well, progressive Christians hurt people too, so their critiques of hierarchy fall apart. Because then, at that point, hierarchies are going to continue to remain, and they're going to continue to cause harm. Christians often tell me that I go too far in deconstructing hierarchy. They wish I wouldn't go as far as I do. But as I clearly show in this piece that came out Wednesday night, the problem isn't that we're going too far in deconstructing hierarchy, but that we're not going far enough. Because as you'll see, the moment the hierarchies appear is the moment the harm is done. And so for this episode, I want to read this article to you. And I may occasionally interject some thoughts as they come to mind. I'm not sure, but we'll just have to see how it goes. And I hope as we look at this article together, we will all reflect on any potential power dynamics of hierarchy that may be lurking somewhere within us still. The title of the piece is Allegations Against Tim Whitaker and the New Evangelicals Show How Hierarchy Transfers to Progressive Ministries. It was written by Rick Pidcock and published by Baptist News Global on March 19th, 2025. Spiritual abuse while protecting a theological and institutional hierarchy is a common story in conservative evangelicalism today. But on Sunday night, the script appeared to flip when news broke that Boz Tchividjian's organization, Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment, had been investigating Tim Whitaker and his organization, the New Evangelicals, who are some of the most popular names in progressive Christianity today. When stories of abuse break regarding conservative evangelicalism, many of us focus on how the abuse was the fruit of theological and institutional hierarchy. Of course, men who think they're entitled by God to be the authorities over women and children are going to abuse women and children. And it's easy to call out the likes of John MacArthur or John Piper, who are famous for promoting these hierarchies. But what about when progressive Christians get caught in scandals? Does that mean progressive Christians or ex-evangelicals are going too far in our critique of conservative evangelical theologies and ethics of hierarchy because we abuse people too? When we carefully examine this week's story about Tim Whitaker and the New Evangelicals, we'll realize the problem isn't that we're going too far in our critique of hierarchy, but that we're not going far enough. We're not recognizing remnants of hierarchy in ourselves and our friends. Now, I'll stop here and just say, as a side note, I do mention spiritual abuse in this introduction. I am referring to the topic that is being discussed often in conservative evangelicalism. The 94-page report does not explicitly say that Tim is guilty of spiritual abuse. It even says that he was not considered a spiritual authority by the people involved. But that said, he was an authority, and he was mistreating them, and he has admitted to that as well. So take that for what you will. I just wanted to clarify on some of the terms that are being used in the introduction to this. I'm dealing with this story, but I'm also using it to speak into a larger conversation in the church. So moving on. Who are Tim Whitaker and the New Evangelicals? Whitaker, a former worship leader, began noticing in 2020 how conservative evangelicals were dismissing Black Lives Matter and minimizing the dangers of COVID. So he started an Instagram account called The New Evangelicals to document his journey deconstructing conservative evangelicalism. His critiques included evangelical threats of hell, the exclusion of LGBTQ people in male-dominated hierarchies in the church and home. When his platform began to take off, he started a nonprofit with a board for accountability and a budget for fundraising. According to a presentation Whitaker gave in December 2024, TNE had amassed 323,000 followers, behind only Relevant and Christianity Today in that segment of the religion market. According to Whitaker, they also had $206,000 in funding, an impressive start for a new organization. In addition to his other successful podcast, Whitaker teamed with progressive Christian influencer April Ajoy for the Tim and April Show, which launched February 21st and almost immediately shot up the charts. By March 15th, they had reached the number 4 spot in top shows for Apple Podcasts in the religion and spirituality category. A shocking revelation. But then on Sunday night, news broke that Whitaker was the focus of an abuse of power investigation by Bozjovich's organization, Grace. That report had been instigated by his own board of directors in response to a formal grievance filed. Because Ajoy had become such a trusted figure among progressive Christians and ex-evangelicals, many people raised questions about what she knew. Did she sign on to the new show knowing Whitaker was under investigation from Grace? That didn't seem like something she would do. Or did T&E offer her the show without disclosing to her that Whitaker was under investigation? That would be quite an omission. When asked on Monday about what she knew, Ajoy said, "I was made aware of the situation last night, and am currently doing everything I can to fully understand what happened. For now, the show is on pause." And I just gotta say, right here, this is kind of a big deal. The fact that April Ajoy had no idea until the night the news broke that the organization she was joining for a show was part of a Grace investigation. That's kind of a big deal, especially because April Ajoy, if you read her book, she has a lot of traumas that she's had to deal with over the years and in her own journey. And so it's not sensitive to her journey and to those who trust her to then not happen to mention to her that there's this big investigation that's going on. Whether you agree with the findings of the investigation, whether you want this to get out is irrelevant. The fact is that it's there, and it's not sensitive to her and to those that trust her to withhold that information from them. Put the ball in her court, let her make the decision on whether or not she wants to join the show or not. Allegations. The allegations against Whitaker and T&E listed in Grace's report are summarized as follows. How Whitaker related to leadership, power, and character issues, an alleged incident of rage driving, mishandling of allegations about the above. According to an alleged victim of Whitaker's rage, referred to as RV, she began following TNE in 2021, soon began volunteering for them, and became a paid contractor in 2023. For her contract work, she regularly flew across the country to meet with Whitaker. With 30 years of respected expertise in brand, creative, and nonprofit strategy, RV knew how to take TNE to the next level. In fact, she helped build TNE nearly from the beginning of its nonprofit stage up to more than 100,000 followers and $100,000 in donations. But the report says when she worked with Whitaker himself, things were disorganized, with Whitaker allegedly preferring to work in a very unstructured way. Despite initially trusting Whitaker, RV began observing Whitaker to be less receptive to feedback and insight over time, which led to a sense of fear that was yet indefinable. She said later she noticed something about him that just did not want to be challenged. It was kind of his rules. While working on a documentary in the spring of 2024, RV had to make significant adjustments to a script and was running late. In an interview with BNG, RV explained, "The script was incredibly long, and Tim incrementally provided a very rough draft that was riddled with issues, little to no punctuation, misspellings, and poor overall structure. I had to extensively rewrite it as it came through. He delayed getting me this last section, which made the timeline extremely difficult. I was working almost all night to make up for the delay from him and be ready for filming the next day. I woke up early to keep working on it, went to a coffee shop to complete the work, and got so immersed in it I lost track of time. I was 40 minutes late. I like to have structured video shoots, so that amount of lateness is embarrassing to me, and I called and apologized profusely as I got in my car to drive over. And I had this really bad feeling as I left. Because of this, I asked to drive. He told me to get in his car. When she got in his car, she said, 'You could just cut the air with a knife.' He was driving very fast. He was changing lanes. He was honking, cussing, muttering, and I just couldn't get him to calm down," she told Grace. "It was just rage driving. I remember in that moment I laughed because I was so scared. I remember thinking, I'm on the other side of the country from my family. I'm in a car with a big guy. He's 6'4". He's very loud and he's very angry, and I'm scared. I was scared for my safety. I knew he wouldn't directly hurt me, but I was scared of this. This driving is unsafe." Now, I gotta say, some people at this point have responded by dismissing this situation and saying, "Oh, she shouldn't have been so scared. She was just triggered by her past." And that's a scary situation. I can see being in a car with an angry man who's driving erratically. That's something that many people who are victims of abuse experience. And so you put yourself in this situation and you're with a man who's angrily driving. It's a common experience that many of us have with either dads or husbands that were angry, specifically angry at us, and were driving in a way that made us feel unsafe. So I just have to name that is something that many people feel and many people experience, and it makes perfect sense that that would be an issue for her. Unwilling to discuss. 12 days later, when RV approached Whitaker about what had happened, she said he was irritated, even combative, and said, "Why are you bringing it up now? I feel like you're blindsiding me. What if you go public with this? Are you going to go public with this?" As RV attempted to reason with Whitaker, she told Grace Whitaker would raise his voice and attempt to blame her. RV told BNG, "I wanted him to know his behavior was frightening and affected my sense of trust and safety in working with him. I got a sense he thought I was overreacting and that frustrated him, but I knew he crossed a tangible line that couldn't happen again with someone else. It would compromise TNE." After one particularly long phone conversation, Whitaker suggested they see a mediator. The mediator was Laura Anderson, who had appeared on TNE's podcast. "He told me he had done an episode with Dr. Laura in the past, but it seemed like a one-off, and he only knew her as an acquaintance," RV told BNG. The important thing to note here is that the report shows he was more connected to her and talked to her several times. Most problematic is that he released an episode with her the same day as the mediation. It was an incredibly uncomfortable thing to discover after the mediation earlier that day. I was afraid of bringing it up because every time I would advocate for myself, he would get angrier, retaliate more, and withhold work and communications. During one Zoom session, RV overheard Whitaker and Anderson laughing together, which caused her to question the impartiality of Anderson's role as a mediator, and she felt much of the mediation was biased against her. I had to tell him the mediator and the release of the episode was a conflict of interest and improper power dynamics, she told BNG. He absolutely exploded at me over the phone, angrily challenging this concern. That was our last conversation. I asked the board to intervene. TNE's fundraising operations coordinator and I filed a grievance. The board kept protecting Tim and delaying resolution, so we both resigned that day. According to RV, Whitaker demonstrated deeper issues that revealed a demonstrable inability to listen, empathize, apologize, and change. She said the money TNE had raised enabled an engaging personality to build a personal kingdom and maintain an unchecked hold on the daily operations, messaging, management, and impact of every aspect of the work. The Grace Report. The Grace Report concluded that Whitaker committed behavioral misconduct in the form of verbal, nonverbal, and physical acts that were improper, including a lack of self-control, controlling behaviors, and holding double standards. Grace also cited 3 additional examples of allegations in 2022 and 2023 involving someone associated with TNE. Now, as a side note, I want to say one of those occasions was an incident where the Theology Beer Camp was hosting a speaker, Tony Jones, that had been credibly accused by his wife of physical abuse. And there's been hospital and legal documents showing this. And R.L. Stoller has done some great work on uncovering a lot of that. So, and in that situation, Tim was being called out on the TNE Facebook page where people were saying you shouldn't be, you should call out this person, supposed friend here, who is being accused of these things, and you shouldn't be, just acting like everything's fine and going on stage with them. And Tim wouldn't see the issues there. And again, Grace called him out on some of those things. You can find some of that in the 94-page report. You can also find some of that story in the link at the very bottom of this article of the Conversation in the Desert Sanctuary podcast. They get into a lot of that. So back to the Grace Report. Among their recommendations to TNE, Grace suggested that the board decenter Whitaker as the source of primary creative control and personality of TNE, provide training for board members and Whitaker on collaborative and equitable leadership, nonprofit governance, power dynamics, domestic abuse, and engage in sharing decision-making that reflects full participation, mutual understanding, inclusive solutions, and shared responsibility. Whitaker and TNE's board have said they agree with the findings of the Grace Report, but how they'll ultimately respond to the concerns being raised will be revealed over time. The alleged victims are sharing their perspectives of TNE's response on their site, TNE Reckoning. Grace and Whitaker response. A representative of TNE's board has said the organization's leadership, including Whitaker, are working toward reconciliation. That representative posted a video on Instagram 11 days after the Grace Report was made public. Whitaker also spoke on the board video to give his response to the Grace Report. There, he said, the investigation was initiated so that I could know what I did wrong, and the board could know what they did wrong, and so we can have a better path forward to reconcile with RV and the main witness and own up to the mistakes that we made. We had a real gap in our policies and procedures that would have better protected RV. He acknowledged that his attempts to reconcile were inadequate and that the mediator that I suggested was a mistake, not because she wasn't qualified, but because of the conflict of interest as stated in the report. The mediator should have been initiated by the board, not by me. In this and other actions, I was operating out of fear and frustration, he said. My intent is to embrace repentance and do better in the future. For my complicity in all of this, I am so sorry. When progressive Christianity doesn't go far enough. Notice the specific words of Grace's recommendations. Collaborative, equitable, shared, mutual, and inclusive. None of these are hierarchy words. On the other hand, the words they choose to describe harm, power dynamics, and domestic abuse depend on hierarchy. Progressive Christian organizations like TNE are correct in calling out the violent hierarchies of conservative evangelicalism, but when progressive Christians or ex-evangelicals set out to do the work of dismantling hierarchy, it can be very easy to start new ministries and organizations that function similarly to their experiences in hierarchy-based churches. There's the superhero lead pastor of the organization, the elder board made up of the lead pastor's closest friends or biggest fans to support the vision and supposedly provide accountability, and all the lay ministers who help the lead pastor expand typically his platform by spreading the word. Now, I gotta say on this part, the report did say that he was not in a spiritual position of authority over these women. But again, this is just something that it's understandable, it's natural when you grow up in an evangelical church and then you're starting an organization after deconstructing that's going to talk about theology and spirituality, and you want it to be an organization where you're the one doing all the talking, and in some of their mission and the services they provide, it talks about preaching Jesus, and it talks about all of this stuff that sounds very much like a church. It's very easy and understandable that people are going to just, whatever their theology is, they're going to set up like a framework and a way of doing things that's just familiar to how they've done things. And so that's, I think, what has happened here is I'm not saying that they were a church. I'm not saying that he had spiritual authority in, as if I'm contrasting the Grace Report. What I'm saying is that he was setting up an organization that very much had a lot of relationships that looked like a church situation. You're discussing theology, you're teaching, and you've got this board that supports you, and you've got all of your lay people that spread the word. These are very familiar ways of setting up organizations. In progressive Christianity, it may seem to be completely different than a local conservative evangelical church because the movement speaks against the evangelical church in so many ways. But the relational framework, institutional allegiance, and missional aim can be very similar. And when tithes, fundraising are involved, and salaries need to be paid, the lines between values and fears can wear thin if people aren't careful or practicing self-awareness. In a conversation on the Desert Sanctuary podcast following an earlier T&E controversy involving Whitaker in 2023, Megan South Benninger said, "You don't see it when it's yourself." This was prior to the Grace investigation, so her words ring even more true today. By not going far enough in dismantling hierarchy or being willing to call it out in our friends, progressive Christians also can lack self-awareness and become complicit in oppressing their neighbors, and survivors of abuse are taking notice. And I think Megan's words really sum it up well there at the end, is you don't see it when it's yourself. And that's really my aim in this piece, is to help progressive Christians think about some of the remnants of hierarchy that may still be in the way we relate to people, in the way we set up organizations, or even in wanting to set up an organization to begin with. There's all kinds of reflections we could have as we look at our own lives and consider the story and wonder, have we gone far enough in dismantling hierarchy, or is it still in our DNA in the way we consider ourselves and relate to others? So that's it for today. I want to thank you for listening, and please like, subscribe, and rate us on your favorite podcast platform, and we'll be back with another episode on Monday.
This has been another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. The episode you've just heard is part of a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State. Be sure to follow BNG daily at baptistnews.com and subscribe to get notifications about future episodes. Baptist News Global is a national nonprofit news service that is independent, free, and faithful. BNG is supported by readers and listeners like you. Learn more at baptistnews.com.